Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 27th of March. My name's Maggie Lennon. We'll begin the programme with a roundup of the week's coronavirus statistics. As of 2 o'clock on Friday, 77,675 new COVID-19 cases had been confirmed in that week. In the past week, 189 newly reported deaths within 28 days of a positive test, and 4,341,965 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, with 4,089,894 having received their second dose. 3,446,630 people have received a third dose or a booster. There were 2,326 people in hospital with recently confirmed COVID, 28 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic in Scotland, a total of 11,287 patients who tested positive have sadly died. We've got a bit of a northeast flavour on the programme today. I'm joined by Richard Thomson, MP for Gordon, and Maureen Watt, former MSP for Aberdeen South and North Kincardine. Good afternoon to you both. Are you both well?
Yes, I am, thank you.
Yeah, I'm quite well as well, Maggie, despite being one of those COVID statistics.
You're one of these COVID statistics. Well, it's very good of you to come onto the programme. That's the great thing about doing it remotely and not putting any of us in the studio at risk. And is it a lovely day in the northeast?
It is.
Good. Well,
shining.
Maureen, you might be able to go out and stretch your legs, but Richard, as he says, is in COVID jail. We'll start the show with a look at the headlines coming out of Ukraine, and then we'll come back to you both as we start to dig into some of these stories in a bit more detail. Joe Biden has condemned Vladimir Putin as a butcher who could no longer stay in power in a historic speech in Poland. The US president appeared to urge those around the Russian president to oust him from the Kremlin, although US officials later said he'd been talking about the need for Putin to lose power over Ukrainian territory and in the wider region. As Biden spoke, Russian missiles rained down on Ukraine's most western city, Lviv, 40 miles from the Polish border. The timing of the attacks, only the third on West Ukrainian targets since the war began, and the closest to Lviv's city centre and its residential areas, was clearly designed to send a message to the White House. The Kremlin has again raised the spectre of the use of nuclear weapons in the war. Dmitry Medvedev, the previous president of Russia and deputy chairman of its Security Council, said Moscow could use them to strike an enemy that only used conventional weapons. The comments prompted Volodymyr Zelensky, appearing by video link at Qatar's Doha forum, to warn that Moscow was a direct threat to the world now. Russia is deliberately bragging that they can destroy with nuclear weapons not only a certain country, but the entire planet, the Ukrainian president said. Ukrainian troops are reporting that Russian forces are using white phosphorus against them near the eastern city of Avdiivka. While these reports could not be confirmed, Zelensky has told NATO leaders that Russia had used phosphorus bombs that had killed adults and children. Russian forces temporarily seized Slavutich, a northern town close to the Chernobyl nuclear site, on Saturday and took prisoner its mayor, Yuri Fomichev. After failing to disperse the numerous protesters in the main square, despite using stun grenades and firing in the air, the Russian troops released the mayor and agreed to leave. The Institute of Mass Media in Ukraine has documented 148 crimes against journalists and the media since the start of the Russian invasion. It said 5 journalists had been killed, 6 captured or kidnapped, and 7 wounded. The Ukrainian parliament has confirmed a fresh Russian attack on the nuclear research reactor in Kharkiv. In a tweet, it quoted the State Nuclear Regulatory Inspectorate as saying, "It is currently impossible to estimate the extent of damage due to hostilities that do not stop in the area of the nuclear installation." And experts in the UK have warned that its Homes for Ukraine scheme risks operating as Tinder for sex traffickers. The warning comes as evidence emerges that UK-based criminals are targeting women and children fleeing the war. Richard, I want to start looking at Biden's comments. So what he said in his speech was that Putin could not stay in power. Now, surely Biden is just expressing what the vast majority of right-minded thinking people are thinking. That wasn't suggesting regime change, or was it?
I don't think it was. I think he was just saying something that an awful lot of people think, that this man, Vladimir Putin, is unfit to lead the great nation of Russia, and his, quite frankly, his behaviour and the bloodthirsty manner in which he sought to brutalise Ukraine puts him utterly beyond the pale. Now, I think I think a little bit more of Mr. President Biden as a result of that. And if I was an American diplomat, I think diplomatic politesse means you have to say what the president really meant was. But actually, I think in saying that, by letting the guard slip a bit, President Biden spoke for very many of us. Of course, there's a world away from wishing something and actually bringing that about. And I have to say that I think any attempts to topple Putin that were not domestic would be exceptionally unwise at this time, and would trigger a whole chain reaction of events, and which we would not wish to see. So, there's a difference here, I would suggest, between the rhetoric that encapsulates much of what we all feel, and the reality of actually seeing that through, which I don't think is on anyone's agenda.
Maureen, barely had Biden said these words, then, as Richard said, his aides leapt to his defence almost to say, no, that's not what he meant. And they're actually now trying to spin it this morning that he didn't say in power, he said in power, that he shouldn't be empowered to stay in the Ukraine, which is clearly just not true. That's not what he said. I was a bit surprised at how quickly the White House kind of tried to cover up what he said. It's almost as if they're playing this, he's a slightly dottery old man and he's not really very sure. And quite a number of people in Europe have been saying, oh, this is making the situation much, much worse. But it is time for plain speaking, is it not? I mean, I think Biden knew very well what he was saying. I don't think it was a mistake at all. Would you agree?
I certainly would agree with you, Maggie, on that. But it just shows how everybody has to tread on eggshells in relation to Russia, and particularly their leader, Vladimir Putin. I mean, anything that the West says could be taken any which way by Putin, and we just don't know what the consequences would be, whether he would escalate the war in Ukraine to include chemical weapons or nuclear weapons. So I can understand both sides, but I do agree with Richard and when he said that Biden spoke for many of us in relation to how we feel about Vladimir Putin. I mean, when you think about things going forward, I mean, how on earth could Putin expect to be welcomed at any international summits or conferences? We saw the Prime Minister getting the cold shoulder this week in Europe. And imagine what it would be for Putin. And he is such a volatile character that you just don't know what is going to happen going forward.
There's quite an interesting video doing the rounds on social media. Somebody's taken a whole lot of meetings that Putin's had with world leaders where he's extended his hand to have his hand shaken and nobody wants to shake his hand. It's like sort of Putin no mates. But joking aside, do you think this sudden, oh no, that's not what we meant, we weren't suggesting regime change, do you think that makes us look weak, Richard, in the face of this master bully?
I think we can obsess over things like this too much. Biden has said what he said. He's spoken for many. Everybody understands it's not heralding any moves from the West to change leadership in Russia, because that has to happen organically. I don't think it makes anybody look weak. I think it shouldn't divert us from the humanitarian crisis that's there, but also the real danger in this is that Putin, from his 3-day objectives, is now nearly 5 weeks into this conflict and has not advanced any further. And that makes it very dangerous, paradoxically. Obviously for the Ukrainians who are now who have been bombarded for weeks, but also in terms of how Putin might choose to try and escalate this as he feels cornered. because his power, his military power, his economic power is diminishing as a result of sanctions. The Ukrainians have fought them not just at a standstill, but are also now be able to change tactics and repel Russian forces. And the question is how this ends, because he's clearly sent an inadequate and ill-prepared and under-supported invasion force. And it was never enough, that those 150,000 troops, to occupy a country where they weren't welcome, and certainly not now. And he certainly... There is no way that Putin can ever rule peacefully over over Ukraine and the Ukrainian people who have stood up for their sovereignty and their right to choose who they're governed by, in what way, and what alliances they make.
In the middle of the week, there was a suggestion that the Russians had changed tactics, or not so much changed tactics, but had changed military objectives by suggesting that they were going to concentrate on securing the eastern regions, the two areas that are almost separate and are acting almost as separatist areas in Ukraine, which of course will be one of the things, Maureen, that when we get to peace negotiations, which hopefully happen fairly soon, will be a major issue. So do you think Moscow is kind of not exactly in retreat, and it certainly wouldn't present it as itself as in retreat? It will, I guess, try to spin it that actually its objectives always were to maintain those two eastern regions and bring them possibly back into Russia. So is Moscow in retreat, or are we being lulled into thinking that? I mean, as Richard says, when you catch a rat against a wall, it kind of goes for the jugular. Putin gave an interview recently where he gave that description. He talked about as a young boy trapping a rat and it going for him, jumping up to try and rip his throat out. And it was seen by a lot of people as his kind of way of going, I'm the rat, so be careful what you do. So do you think there is a possibility that... they're talking about dirty bombs, the phosphorus. They used it in Syria, so they've got track record on that. And even strategic nuclear weapons. Do you think there is a real possibility that we will see more of those threats and possibly these things happening in the next week or two? Maureen, sorry. Oh, Maureen has frozen. Richard, do you think so?
I think there's going to be a ramping up of the rhetoric from Moscow, certainly. But, I think this reframing of the objectives is just...
Oh, sorry. Yeah, keep going, Richard.
Okay. I think the reframing, if you like, of the objectives that we've seen, I don't think anybody's fooled by that at all. Putin's objectives were clear: to depose President Zelensky's government, install a friendly government with the objective of having a demilitarised client state on its border, and also to discourage others from having other countries on Russia's borders from having aspirations to be part of a more Western orientated outlook. And if he'd wanted to occupy fully the Donbass, I think they had almost had the capability to do this, but he spread his resources far too thinly in this, and in actual fact, he's just completely found himself being pushed back on a number of fronts, not only in terms of military objectives on the ground in Ukraine, but also he's strengthened the NATO military alliance at a time when, just a couple of years ago, French President Macron was openly questioning what NATO was actually for. I think we now understand what it's for, and it's to respond to the threats that have been there for most of the second half of the last century that come from those who are in power in Russia and its client states. So I think he's and not only all of that, he's also weakened his control in Russia, because while there may not be any immediate threat of a popular uprising against him, there will be those in his entourage round about him who are seeing that this man is not the infallible colossus that he's been able to present himself as in Russian politics for much of the last 20 years. And people will be thinking about who comes next and where they stand in that. And that's very dangerous for Putin domestically.
Yeah. I want to turn now to the story about the Homes for Ukraine. So this is the British scheme where families can nominate to give a spare room to a Ukrainian refugee who's been given a visa to come to the United Kingdom for up to 6 months. Quite a few people who are working in the refugee industry, if you like, are rather concerned about this. Sponsorship has always been a possibility for several years, but it was never suggested that individual people would end up housing refugees. It was usually more a suggestion that a conglomerate of people or agencies would get together, negotiate housing with a local authority, and for 6 months would have oversight of the refugee to try and make sure they can stand on their own 2 feet. Obviously, there are huge issues around people's safety, and everybody who's applying to give a home to a Ukrainian will have to go through a disclosure check. And these things take time, they can take 6 weeks, so there's going to be a delay. But more worrying is this report that there are UK criminal gangs and people who are involved in sex trafficking who are kind of circling around, putting up false agencies on Facebook suggesting that they'll do the matching. And there's a suggestion that vulnerable women, many of them on their own or with young children, could get sucked into this. And there are reports that this has been happening in Poland as well, where obviously refugees are turning up. So, Maureen, are you aware of these stories, and how concerned are you that this, if it's not managed properly and has real oversight by the UK government, whose scheme it is, that this could be a real disaster?
I think this has always been one of the side effects of war, and it's good that we're aware of it and obviously know that this is a possibility. And in fact, there are some signs that this is happening already. I mean, it's absolutely despicable. I cannot imagine how it must be if you land in a situation where you become sex trafficked when you're fleeing from a war. It's just pain upon pain. And it really is important that every family, and it's great that so many families have come forward to step in where the UK government has failed the refugees in Ukraine. But it does come with the fact that people will have to go through disclosure checks, and whether even the disclosure checks and the checks that are put in place will manage to catch the sex traffickers remains to be seen, but I sincerely hope that it does.
And it appears that the responsibility for the disclosures and the matching will fall to local authorities. I mean, it's as if the government is really trying to do this lightest touch version of support. They've set this scheme up, but they don't want to have anything to do with it, Richard. They don't want to monitor it. They don't want to be involved in deciding who goes where. I know the Scottish government have a slightly different approach, which is the Scottish government would be the national sponsor and they would be responsible for doing the matching. But we don't have a lot of we don't have a lot of details about that. It's also not clear yet how much funding local authorities will be given, because obviously they'll have to take on board the educating of children and all the other things. Do you think I'm hearing, because I work in the refugee world, I'm getting contacts from a lot of local authorities in Scotland who really don't seem to know exactly what's happening. Do you think there's just more, do you think the scheme's actually going to get off the ground? That's the first thing. There are still 11,000 Afghans sitting in bridging hotels who've not been resettled, despite the fact that Kabul fell in August. So do you think it will go ahead? And do you think there's going to be so much confusion that actually it's not going to really give very many people a chance of safety, Richard?
Well, I hope it does go ahead, because we very much need it to go ahead. And I hope that it brings home to people at large just how fragile sometimes our comfortable existences are, and that at any time that could be upended, and we ourselves could, although it's a remote possibility living where we do, but nevertheless people who enjoy lifestyles similar to our own can find their quiet lives upended by any number of things, from natural disasters to wars of aggression, as we've seen, and that we should be looking to treat people in those situations exactly as we ourselves would expect to be treated in that position if we were there ourselves. I've been strident at Westminster, along with my SNP colleagues, about calling for people to be put ahead of process. There were some very significant delays in granting visas a few weeks ago by the UK Home Office, precisely because they wanted to do safeguarding exercises and go through that. And our argument then, and I think rightly, was put people before process. There is a much greater danger to people from the situation that they're in currently in Ukraine than there is from bringing them to a place of safety where they are at least safe from bombs and bullets and missiles. But in terms of that doesn't remove the need for that safeguarding to take place. Now, local authorities, as you know, got a great deal of experience in the safeguarding process. So, as long as the resources are there to back that up, I've no concerns about local authorities being in charge of those bits of those processes in those areas, particularly if they're involved in helping to coordinate the whole wraparound support that needs to be there, as you said, whether it's in terms of housing, whether it's in terms of education, social work, medical needs, anything else that's round about that. But just because we've accepted refugees in that situation, that doesn't mean it's the end of the process. There is that ongoing need for wraparound support, but also we can't lose who's come in and where they've gone and who they're with and what their welfare is. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't previously aware of, although I have to say I'm not surprised that some not very nice people are looking to the opportunities that. I think that we can be flexible in terms of our approach to letting people in without diminishing our own safety or the security of those who are coming in. But that means that there is a job of work to be done afterwards to make sure that people, having been brought to a place of safety, are also in a place of safety and safe from the other harms that might befall them from the unscrupulous.
Well, indeed, if people are going to give a Ukrainian a home, it's only for 6 months, but the suggestion is people might be here for an awful lot longer. And Maureen, that's what kind of concerns me, is what happens after that 6 months, or what happens if before that 6 months, people who have done a decent humanitarian thing and owned their homes find that really they can't cope with this. The trauma that some of these Ukrainian refugees will have witnessed will be horrific. And then really, unless you're kind of qualified in dealing with that or have some idea how to manage that, you could really find that you have people living with you with whom you're just simply not equipped to deal with or offer any kind of support. And, offering someone a home in a kind of almost knee-jerk humanitarian reaction as the right thing to do is very different from having someone living with you for 6 months where there may be problems with language or there may be problems with cultural issues, who gets to do the cooking, when do they get to do the cooking, all of these things become a real issue. And what worries me is that, after maybe a few weeks, people might regret what they've done and then what happens to the refugees? Because at the moment there is no there's no discussion about that. And we know that local authorities at the moment are struggling to find houses for the Afghans who've been resettled. Now, some of that's to do with the fact the Afghan families tend to be slightly larger and we just don't have the houses that fit that. So as I say, there's 11,000 Afghans still in bridging hotels across the United Kingdom. I'm not convinced that local authorities will necessarily have a lot of spare housing. So, this is something that really needs to be carefully considered. And I'm not aware of any kind of support for people who are really thinking about taking refugees into their homes, if there's any kind of, training or any kind of support that they're getting. I don't know if you've heard about anything, Maureen.
Well, I haven't heard of anything specific for refugees from Ukraine, but here in Aberdeenshire, we have successfully settled a number of families from Syria very well. So I would say that many local authorities in Scotland have experience of coping with this. But you're right, it is very different when you're offering people a place in your home. And although they say it's for 6 months, it might be much longer, although I'm sure Ukrainians will want to go back to their own countries as soon as it is safe to do so. And especially when their male family members are still there, there's an added incentive to go back. But these are problems that not just the UK are dealing with, that other countries are dealing with on a more massive scale than the UK. And I'm sure that they can be sorted out. If they can be sorted out in other countries, they can be here. And I think we have got to really support those families who have the goodwill to take in Ukrainian refugees as much as we possibly can. And I'm sure all the organisations, not just local authorities, but voluntary organisations will be helping as well.
And I think really what needed to happen was the British government should have done what it did vis-a-vis the Syrian and the Afghan crisis and just brought people in to resettle them. And that way they're not having to live with members of the public. They get their own place to stay, which is possibly much safer, their own space, which is something that refugees desperately need. The last thing they need is people asking them too many questions, for example. People don't necessarily want to talk about what they've witnessed. And if they do talk about it, they want to talk about it to people who can handle that. So we'll see how it goes. I don't think we'll see anything like the numbers that the government have suggested. And I do take my hat off to people who are willing to put themselves in the front line, as it were, by offering that kind of humanitarian support. Back home, we have been looking all week at the impact of the Chancellor's spring statement. Obviously, it didn't really deliver anything for anybody who isn't in work, so it missed out huge numbers of the population. It didn't help anybody who's on mean-tested benefits, and it has been widely slated by people within his own party, as well as obviously the opposition. As ever, Scotland is being faced with the difficult choice of using the money that it does have in order to mitigate some of these worst excesses. Maureen, on Sunday last week, we talked about Katie Forbes' letter to the Chancellor saying this is what you really need to be doing, and it was a great big long list of requests, and we said at the time it's a very good letter, but actually nothing will happen. And of course none of the things that she suggested could happen did happen, and she's come out again in public today and said that it's still failing people with the biggest challenge, which is soaring energy costs and cost of living increases. And the Scottish Government have just announced a whole new raft of funding to help. So there's additional money for Fuel Insecurity Fund, which will help people with energy costs. And there's a whole raft of new money being earmarked to help tackle child poverty. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I'm not really up to speed on the whole details, but I know that Shona Robertson this week has increased the child payment to £25 when it was originally £10 and then going to be £20 and £25. But without the full levers of an independent country, it's very difficult. I mean, I don't know where Kate Forbes finds all these pots of money to be able to increase and help people when it's the Westminster government that is creating this poverty among so many of our citizens. And as you said, Maggie, especially people who are on benefits which are not being uprated with the cost of inflation. And poverty is just going to soar among our population. And, you know, every time we try in Scotland to alleviate poverty, especially child poverty, yet another burden is put on the Scottish Government by this callous Westminster government who simply don't care about those who are most in need at the bottom. And they keep saying that, you know, go into work, but work is so badly paid in so many situations that I can't see a way out of it unless the Westminster government changes its face, and it's not going to, is it? It just helps the rich.
Absolutely. It's a good point Maureen raises there, Richard. Where does the Scottish Government keep getting this money that they keep announcing? I mean, I'm presuming it's coming out of someone else's pocket, but we don't know where. But also, it makes you think, doesn't it? If Scotland was not having to spend that money to mitigate the worst of the cuts and the austerity that we've been living with for a long, long time now, just think what else we could do with that money. So although we're doing the right thing, it's with kind of one hand tied behind our back, is it not?
No, absolutely. I mean, I was involved in the debate on the partial U-turn that the Conservatives have done on the national insurance rise. Now, it's still a rise, but they've taken the edge off it. And that debate took place in Westminster last Thursday. And I had to put up with a couple of Tory backbenchers. There's one who started sneering at me, you know, why doesn't the Scottish Government use its tax and benefit powers that it already has, to which I said, well, it is. I refer you to the Scottish child payment and all the rest of it. Then I had another one whining that there's too much tax being levied in Scotland. So they're kind of taking this kind of almost sadistic glee in saying you're not taxing enough, actually you're taxing too much, and hoping that we spend our time rattling around in between those two poles. And of course, both arguments are utterly bogus and completely dishonest, and exactly what you'd expect from the new breed of Tory MPs on the make, because my point was quite clear. The Scottish Government's budget, for all the additional tax powers that eventually grudgingly came after the referendum in 2014 through the Smith Commission, the Scottish Government's budget is still set in very large parts by policy decisions that have to be taken in England first. And we saw the weaknesses of that during the pandemic. And I've said this before on Broadcasting Scotland, that even if there was a need in Scotland to act in a particular way with a particular amount of resource, the resource in order to tackle that would not be made available as an additional resource unless there was a similar need experienced in England and the UK government decided to spend money on that thing in England. And furlough would have been a classic example of that. So it means there's a complete mismatch between policy and resources. But also, if we are constantly in Scotland having to find money to mitigate the worst effects of these callous, and there's no other word for it, policy decisions such as withdrawing universal credit or the rape clause that there is, the two-child benefit cap, and the spare room supplement, then that is money that is effectively coming straight out of the delivery of frontline services. So we're getting attacked on a number of fronts in the SNP and the Scottish Government from you're taxing too much, why don't you tax more, what you're not spending enough on frontline services, why aren't you doing this, why aren't you doing that? And it's all just to create a swirl of opprobrium that, in the hope that it somehow tarnishes a competent, popular Scottish government. And I'd like to think most folk anyway, are too wise to get bogged down in that. But it does feel a bit at Westminster when you're confronted by these individuals that you're just swatting at a cloud of midges sometimes. But I'm very pleased I was in the position to put both of those gentlemen correct.
Bogus and dishonest. I'm not sure that's parliamentary language, Richard, but never mind. Maureen, you were talking about that work is not always the answer. And actually, when you look at the plans that the Scottish Government have just announced for tackling child poverty, they are saying that they hope that by 2023, that's 2 years away, year and a half, more than 60,000 fewer children could be living in relative poverty compared to what they were in 2017. Now, this seems, despite the cost of living squeeze, so I'm not sure, that seems very, very ambitious given what we're facing. And as well as it being about giving money, increasing the Scottish Child Payment from £20 to £25 and all the rest of it and extending that benefit, one of the pillars of this child poverty delivery plan is significantly increasing employment services with the aim of supporting up to 12,000 parents to enter and progress in sustainable and fair work. And the first thing that leaps out to me is childcare, because there isn't childcare. There's not enough childcare available that people can afford to make that happen. And there's a real crisis in the early years education sector at the moment. Private nurseries will tell you that the money that they get for the places that they offer from local authorities just simply don't cover their costs. It means that they're relying on taking very young staff who are on apprenticeship wages, and really what they're needing is to take in much older staff, older women and men who would be good role models for the children, the very people that they're trying to get back into work. So I'm not convinced, and I think, Maureen, your point that not all jobs pay well is a very valid one. So the Scottish Government have got their fair work agenda, but the problem is there are still, and women in particular, are still 60% of women in the world are working in the informal economy. They tend to work in non-sustainable, low-paid, low-skill, entry-level jobs, and they're really at risk of losing their jobs. So I'm slightly concerned that although this on paper looks good, actually, is this going to deliver what the government want it to deliver unless we can see a massive upscaling of wages and conditions for people?
I mean, I think that's what Richard and I have been saying, isn't it? That anything that the Scottish Government is doing, they're doing it with one hand tied behind their back. So it's almost as if, the Scottish Government has its policies on fair work and on reducing child poverty. But at every stage, the government in Westminster are throwing brickbats at us, to say you can't do that. And everything that we're trying to do is being sabotaged, if you like, by the Westminster and its policies. So, I'm proud that the Scottish Government has increased nursery provision to the level of primary school hours, and that definitely helps people, families, parents back into work. But yes, there's always more that we can do. And, local government while it gets its fair share of from the Scottish government, is being subjected to the same cuts that the Scottish government is from Westminster. So yes, we're always working in what seems to be an ever decreasing envelope of money, and you know, and private nurseries, are one of those casualties of that, and it's very difficult to see at the moment how local authorities can increase the money to various organisations, not just private nurseries, in a situation where they're having to try and increase the money for council workers in the face of inflation, rampant inflation. And these are choices that the Westminster government is making. I mean, how is it that France can have a 4% levy cap on increases in energy in France, but we let energy prices go rampant? These are choices that the Westminster government is making.
Yes, but the big choice, it's not a choice that government makes. It's how you can make sure that people do get fair work with decent wages. I mean, we can't forget that the vast majority of people who are on universal credit in this country are working parents. In work poverty is an absolute disgrace. I mean, it beggars belief that in the fifth richest country in the world, that people can be working, long hours and still needing to get their salaries topped up by benefit because employers are not prepared to pay enough. And that's why it's all very well to say get more people into work and that will help child poverty. But if the jobs aren't there or the salaries are not there, and there's a squeeze on business as well because everyone's suffering because of rising costs. It's difficult to see how we can break that cycle in some way. I mean, Richard, have we now got to the point that the whole system, the whole benefit system is just broken and that people are not going to get out of a sort of poverty trap in the future?
Well, I've felt that for a while, and I think there is a danger that we throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I mean, the Conservatives, when they talk about the benefit system being broken, want to create a whole range of traps that force people out into a set of choices that they might not otherwise make. But at the same time, in terms of providing support for those who are seeking work, it should never, as it used to sometimes be, act as a trap. There should always be an incentive for going to work, not because you're making the alternatives unbearably tight, but simply because you're incentivizing those who are in a position to go out and seek and obtain gainful employment to do so. And we need to be making sure that we're losing those cliff edges that are still sometimes there in the benefit system, that it's actually not worth your while to go out and work more hours because you're going to lose more in benefits. Now, I think that there's a real danger of a benefit system subsidising cheapskate employers. That's why I was a big supporter of the minimum wage. And I think there are a number of things. In order to make work pay, we need more employers to be paying the real living wage. Now, they've got a bit of a wheeze at Westminster. The Tory government says they're mandating the real living wage. They do that usually around 1 month before the real living wage figure is uprated. So they get to crow about doing that. But for 11 months of the year, the government's advisory on what the real living wage should be is out of step with what the real living wage actually is. So we need to eliminate that dishonesty and try and encourage more employers to be paying that real living wage, not just the minimum wage. But I think also it's not just about the earnings that's there. We have to look at what people's outgoings are. And we've got a housing stock that by European standards is pretty poorly insulated. Even before the recent spike in energy bills, that was costing people far too much and leading to all sorts of adverse outcomes in terms of people's health, particularly children's health. So we need to be making sure that in terms of what the state can also do, that we're making sure people have got homes that are fit to live in. That, as Maureen says, we're doing what we can to cap the cost of energy so that people don't have to make that choice between heating and eating. But I do have to say that I think that the 1,140 hours of childcare will, for a lot of families, be an absolute game changer. It would have been for us when our children were a bit younger. Our kids are up a bit now, so it's not going to affect us. But the cost of childcare when we were in two adults working, not earning great wages necessarily, but working, it was pretty punitive. And So that's, as I say, the 1140 hours is a game changer. We need to get ourselves into a position whereby work is paying, whereby people's expenses are not crippling as they are at the moment in the cost of living crisis, so that more people can take advantage of that childcare, which can be good for the children, it can be good for the parents, and it allows more people, not always women, but particularly women, to get into the workplace if that's what they want to do. And I think it's about allowing people to make the right choices for their particular circumstances, and the 1140 hours is certainly a part of that, at least from my perspective.
Well, of course, the impact of childcare affects women to a factor of 3 more than it does men, and that's one of the reasons that gender equality is lagging behind. United Nations tweeted this week a list of the top 10 countries which have achieved gender equality, and the list was empty because, quite frankly, no country in the world in 2022 has achieved gender equality. It seems bizarre to think that that's the case, but it absolutely is. In fact, the suggestion is that the gender gap is growing, not diminishing, and COVID has been a major part of that. We know that women have been affected much more by COVID. The number of women frontline key health and social care workers, for example. Women, as we've been discussing, are more affected by poverty and vulnerable working conditions, and so many people's jobs were so severely diminished during the pandemic. And there's a suggestion that COVID has set back some of the progress, fairly small progress, I have to say, that we've seen in recent years. And while it's true that across the world there are more girls going to school, and there are more women in positions of leadership and more women representing elected representatives, it's still only 25% of elected national representatives of women, and under 33% of local elected representatives are women. And this is reminding you that women make up 51.5% of the population. So in Scotland, gender equality has been on the minds of the First Minister. The First Minister's National Advisory Council for Women and Girls has just appointed its 2 new co-chairs after the other 2 have just stepped down after a tenure of 4 years. Maureen, if you were advising the First Minister on how to really tackle gender equality in Scotland, and I'm going to ask you to be fairly brief on this, what would be your top 3 things that you think she needs to do?
Ooh, wow. That's a difficult question to answer in a very short time. And you're right about what you said about, if you looked at the NATO meeting this week, there were hardly any women leaders there. And this week we've also heard that Afghan girls are not going to be allowed back into school after all. I know that the First Minister is very involved in making sure that in terms of local election candidates for the elections coming up, that we try as far as possible to have gender equality. But as you say, it's not easy because women are in, maybe trying to hold down 3 jobs just to make ends meet. And when there's not childcare on offer from councils, I remember when I was a councillor asking for it and was told to virtually go and buy on my head, it just is not happening. So we are putting barriers up for women all the time. And until men realise that we are equals, it is going to be very, very difficult. And like you said, for some reason, I don't know why, we seem to be going backwards instead of forwards. It's very worrying. So off the top of my head, I can't think of 3 reasons, but I'm sure I could come up with if I got the call from Nicola.
Richard, the UN report that in the world 20% of women between the ages of 15 and 49 have experienced physical or sexual violence from an intimate partner within the previous 12 months. So that's not including violence against women from people that they don't know, sort of random attacks. That's 1 in 5 women between the ages of 15 and 49 have been attacked. That's part of it, isn't it? That's what's holding women back. The increase, and it has increased since COVID, of physical and sexual attacks on women.
I'm sure it has, and it's an absolutely appalling statistic. In terms of, I don't really have anything more to say on it than that. Then it's an absolutely appalling statistic, and it's why we need to be making sure that anyone who is in that position of having an abusive partner, whether it's long-term abuse or whether it's the first time it's reared its head, has the ability to get out of that situation and be in full control of their choices.
Well, it is a global issue, and that's really the scary thing, that it's not just in individual countries, it's not just in the third world. It's awful easy sometimes for us in the West to assume that gender inequality is a third world issue. It's not, it's everywhere, and it really has to stop. What else might be coming to a stop these coming days is perhaps the British monarchy. Who knows? It's not been the most exciting or the most successful Caribbean tour that any members of the Royals have had. They've been getting attacked from all sides for a series of bad PR mistakes, appalling optics, and the fact that it seemed to be everywhere they went, Will and Kate either had demonstrations, or perhaps the best one was the Jamaican president or prime minister telling them that probably by the time they'd got back to Blighty, he'd have started discussions about them losing Will's granny as head of state. That can't have been what they were hoping for when they sent these two royals off to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. For those of us who are Republicans at heart, I must admit I did have a kind of a bit of a smile at that. But there were serious issues also came up during that visit, Richard, and the big one, of course, was the issue of apologising for the slave trade. Wills said he had deep sorrow. Sorrow isn't sorry. Does Britain, other countries too, but does Britain need to apologise? And where do you stand on the demands, particularly from the Bahamians, on reparations?
Yeah, I think we need to have an honest appreciation of what our role in the slave trade was. And the slave trade started with empire and dominion, and feeling that you had that we had dominion over others. We can see the legacy of the slave trade in Scotland. We're not immune from that. We can see that in many of the street names in our greatest cities, and there's certainly no getting away from the fact that there were those who profited and prospered from that state of affairs. So yes, I think we need an honest appraisal of the role that our forebears had in that, and to look to see how we can make reparations in a way that is respectful and appropriate for the circumstances that has left those many generations on in.
Because what people are maybe not aware of is the slave owners got reparations. They got reparations for hundreds of years, almost 200 years. People who owned slaves were getting paid off for the fact that they'd lost their slaves after the Emancipation Act. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that, but there's never been any suggestion. And it's not about, no one's suggesting that people who are descendants of former slaves are given a pot of money, but it's about ways of investing, perhaps, in these countries. I mean, one of the things about the Commonwealth that surprised me, Maureen, over the pandemic is it wasn't very much a family of nations. There wasn't an awful lot of real practical help and support being given to some Commonwealth countries from the motherland. We weren't doing anything particular to help with the distribution of vaccines or PPE. Countries were pretty much left to their own devices. And the death rates in some of the Caribbean countries was really, really high, given that the populations are quite small. So do you think this idea that a family of nations and the Commonwealth is the gilt's gone off that particular gingerbread?
But I think there are two things here. One, it seems that Will and Kate were very badly advised about what they might expect when they went to the Caribbean. And I very much blame the advisors of the Queen, the firm as it's called, in terms of not being aware of what was happening in Caribbean countries, the Commonwealth, and what is going to happen when
No, you're breaking up. You're breaking up, Maureen. We can't really hear you.
During the Diamond Jubilee.
Maureen, we can't really hear you, and I don't think you can maybe really hear me. So,
in terms of reparations, I think, as I said, it's very much something. Yeah,
we can't really hear you, Maureen. You're breaking up quite a bit. Richard, the other thing that I thought was really quite bizarre towards the end of the trip, when there was a lot of discussion about the fact that Jamaica have said we're going to go alone. We're going to move on, was the phrase. And there's a suggestion that perhaps the Bahamas might be thinking about it. Obviously, Barbados lost the Queen as head of state in November last year. That William said two things. He said, it's up to the people to decide. And it was suggested that the palace were quite relaxed about it. Well, there's a big change from 2014 then, because the Queen intervened. She made that famous speech or aside asking people to think very carefully about what they were doing and the consequences of their actions. And of course, there was Purrgate. Supposedly, she purred down the line to David Cameron when he told her that the independence referendum had failed. So there's been a bit of a shift. Of course, it's for the people to decide. That's not news to anybody. And really, the palace can be upset or relaxed as much as they want. It won't actually have anything to do with the monarchy in Britain if Jamaica decides to go on its own, will it?
Well, that's it. I mean, it ultimately has to be a democratic choice about what countries, what alliances and organisations they wish to be part of, which kind of loops back in a way to some of the earlier discussions that we were having. But I remember watching a programme many years ago about a Commonwealth summit, and one of the Commonwealth leaders pointing out in the presence of the Queen that the thing about the Commonwealth was that the wealth in it hadn't been very common. And I think it's understandable that people around the Commonwealth countries would have mixed views about shared histories and shared endeavours and what a shared future might look like, or even if there should be one. So while there might be affection for the Queen as an individual, while there might be affection for the monarchy as an institution, while there might be a desire to continue with some kind of shared association, whether or not that involves keeping the Queen as head of state or whether it involves being in the Commonwealth is a choice. And we can see that there are different choices that countries notionally within the Commonwealth have made on that front. But ultimately, it's a choice for peoples about who they are, who they wish to be, and where they wish to go. And you'll be unsurprised to hear that come the day, I think that's a choice that Scots should also have for themselves.
Obviously, the Queen just statistically probably won't be head of state anywhere for very much longer. She's 96 and her health seems to be failing. And Maureen, do you think when the Queen finally goes, that will have an impact on how people in Commonwealth countries feel about the British monarchy if Charles will accede to the throne, he can't not accede to the throne, whether he stays on as king or he abdicates in favour of the young uns, who knows. But do you think that will have an impact on how people feel, not so much about the monarchy at home in the UK? I don't see there being an upsurge of people wanting rid of the monarchy in Britain, certainly not in England. But do you think in the Commonwealth that will have an impact?
Yes, I certainly do. I mean, I think there's genuine affection for the Queen. And I think that when she does pass, I think it will be an opportunity or a situation where many Commonwealth countries will reassess their links with Britain. And it's a time that will happen. I mean, I don't see Charles abdicating in favour of Wales. He's waited a long time. And whether it's the same affection remains in countries with a relation. I don't think that necessarily means leaving the Commonwealth. I think many of the countries of the Commonwealth do appreciate being as rich an opportunity is afforded to the people of Scotland to decide.
And it really became, because the media, I think, were getting so confused with the mixed messages that were coming out, and so many of the photo opportunities were just so dire. I mean, the picture of them touching these children's hands from behind a wire fence was just horrific. It descended into a case of what Katie wore next, and really all they were left to report on was the outfits that the Duchess of Cambridge was wearing. However, it appeared that wherever they went, they were doing a lot for the independence movements of the countries they visited. So maybe Nicola Sturgeon should invite them up to Scotland pretty soon and see if they can work their magic up here. No doubt bedecked in black watch tartan, as they always are. Our final story is back home in Scotland, and it's about some moves towards land reform. There is a land reform bill being proposed. I don't think we know very many details about it, though I will ask my guests if they know of anything and what their views are, as they are both from the northeast. But one thing that is going to happen is there's going to be a new land registry, a register of persons holding a controlled interest in land. It starts from the 1st of April. It's going to mean that it's going to be transparent. We can see who owns all the land in Scotland, even if it's offshore. But Richard, there's no suggestion that apart from shining a light on it, that it's going to make really any changes. So what would you like to see in the land reform bill? Is it enough just to tell us who owns the land? Don't we need to know more about what they're doing with the land, what their plans are, what the tax position is? What would you like to see in the land reform bill for your part of Scotland?
Everything that you've just said, Maggie, but the starting point is knowing who owns it. I have to say I'm more concerned about what happens on the land and in whose benefit, and whether we're getting those who live round about are getting all the opportunities that affords. And there's an awful lot of land in Aberdeenshire which is owned either locally or elsewhere, and there are many owners of that land who do a great deal to promote local economic opportunities. Now, there's a separate discussion about whether they are best placed in many respects to do that, but I think the word I like to see used in this context is stewardship rather than ownership. But I suppose the starting point is about knowing who's got it, and are they making good use of that land, and are they making a positive social and economic contribution in respect of their stewardship of that. But the other change I would like to see is to expand on things like the Scottish Land Fund, so that where there is a willingness, and where there's an opportunity, and where there's a will for communities to take ownership of land, that can happen, and happen in a way that is productive and constructive and conducive to the needs of communities. But at the same time, land ownership, there are farmers who own their land who are clearly contributing productively, and I think we have to be quite clear that there may be areas of land where a kind of common ownership is appropriate, but above all it's about stewardship down the generations and the contribution that's being made. And I wouldn't want to see anything happening that interrupted our food security in our farming communities. But fundamentally, we need to know who owns it. Are they paying an appropriate amount for their ownership, and are they stewarding it correctly in a way that we can be happy with? And if not, that then opens up the discussion about what it might be reasonable to do about that.
Yes, there are penalties for non-compliance if you're not prepared to give your information to this register. It doesn't say what the penalties will be, and there's a 12-month transition period before these penalties kick in. But Maureen, when you were representing Aberdeen South and North Kincardine, was land reform something that was an issue for your constituents? Did people have quite strong views about what needed to happen, what the issues were?
Well, I don't have very many large estates as such. I think we need to make a distinction between the vast tracts of the Highlands and Argyll and areas like that are owned by companies that we can't really drill down and find out who the actual owner is. The land registry and trying to map who owns Scotland has been going on for a long time, but the problem is that it's registered in names of companies, and you can't actually find out who are the people that own it, rather than just company fronts. And we've seen that at the moment in terms of Russian oligarchs. We must be one of the last countries in Europe who has such an open market for our land. And, I think it is time that we become more like countries of Denmark and other Scandinavian countries, where the ownership and the sale of our land is controlled as to who can own it. I think we're past the situation of having vast tracts of our country owned by people whom we don't know, who have not got the best interests of the country or the local population at heart. And we need to, as Richard says, increase the land fund, but I think more radical action is needed. And whether this particular bill goes as far as perhaps I would like, I don't yet know.
Yeah, well, as I say, there's not really been an awful lot of information given out in advance of it, so we will be waiting to see what happens. But this new legislation won't just be something that people who own these vast tracts of land have to think about. I think it's all land. And in urban areas like Glasgow, there is huge amounts of land that are in land banks. People buy up land for development that they sit on for year after year after year after year after year, simply waiting for the increase of the land cost to go up so they can make a killing on selling it, and nothing happens to it. It doesn't get developed. And in a city like Glasgow or any major urban conurbation where housing is at such a premium and facilities for people are so desperately needed, it seems an absolute crime. So my understanding is that this will be for all landowners, no matter whether it's, a massive Highland estate or it's someone who's just clinging on to undeveloped land in a city. That's all we've got time for today. I thank you both, Maureen and Richard, for joining me, and I hope you have a pleasant afternoon, everyone. It just leaves me to finish as normally with the appeal for money. So we've been talking a lot about cost of living increases over the last few weeks, and we do appreciate that people are finding it difficult and pennies are being pinched. But then if you're having large costs in electricity and energy costs at home, we have it too in a studio with all of our equipment. So our costs are going up as well. So we would urge you, please, to think about giving a regular donation to Broadcasting Scotland to keep us on the air. We're free to view, we're non-commercial, we will always be free to view, but that means we do need people to be subscribers and make donations. If you go onto the website, www.broadcastingscotland.scot/donate, you can see how very simple and easy it is to do. So it's Mother's Day today, so for any of you who are celebrating that, have a lovely day. I hope somebody makes you scones or whatever. I persuaded my daughter this year to, rather than send me the normally beautiful hamper of food she sends, she's made a donation to women's charities in the Ukraine. I don't care if that is virtue signalling. Very proud of my daughter to do that. Have a lovely Sunday, and I'll be back on Tuesday evening for the 7 o'clock show. Thank you and good afternoon.